To discuss this topic, we're really fortunate and I'm really happy to have Mr. David Bradley, President of the and CEO of the Canadian Trucking Alliance and the Ontario Trucking Association. David joined OTA as Director of Economics in 1985 after starting his career on Bay Street. 6 years later, at the age of 33, he was promoted to President of the OTA. In 1997, he developed a plan to rejuvenate the national trucking lobby, which culminated in his taking on the additional responsibility of leading the newly formed Canadian Trucking Alliance. He continues in the dual CTA-OTA role to this day. Over the course of his career, David has steered both organizations through some of the industry's most turbulent times, brought on by deregulation, an unrelenting focus on truck safety, free trade, numerous recessions, at least one major overhaul of the tax system, changes to weights and dimension standards, labor unrest, a thickening of the Canada-US border, and environmental regulations, just to name a few. Through all of it, he has been a tireless defender of the industry and a strong advocate of responsible trucking and tough safety standards, demonstrated by his unrelenting support of regulatory initiatives such as mandatory activation of speed limiters and the upcoming requirements for electronic logging devices. He's been quoted over the years as saying he has loved every minute of it. Please help me in welcoming Mr. David Bradley.
Thank you very much, Heidi, for that nice welcome. You probably have the toughest job in the room moderating me. I'm not particularly moderate in my views, but with old age, I am mellowing and moderating, I suppose, a bit. I actually have notes because I find I'm losing my train of thought more and more regularly these days, and I also need cheaters so I can see. It's true that I have loved every moment of the past 32 years that I've been involved with the industry, but as with everything in life, all things must eventually come to an end. So I've announced that I'm leaving my posts at the end of this year. I won't be going too far, I hope, but the day-to-day, it's time for some new ideas and some new energy, and I'm sure some of the people in the room might agree with that. But this does provide me with an opportunity, perhaps for the last time, to share my thoughts and perspectives in my current capacity with you, and also to talk about the important role that all of you play in shaping our industry. You know, a lot of people talk about partnerships. It's one of those overused words. I actually believe in partnerships, and there are several people in this room, including Heidi, who we have developed a very good partnership and working relationship. Maybe it's because of my statesman-like status that I now enjoy, but I never thought I would say things like there's an old saying, but there is an old saying, which is if you don't know where you've been, you can't know where you're going. So I want to start off first with a bit of history, which might explain why I'm a bit pathological about some of the issues that I've been raising with you folks over the years. I started with OTA on October 28, 1985. Now, I don't think other than me and perhaps my mother, anybody in the world cared or took note of that. What they did take note of was that there was a total lunar eclipse that day, and some will say that I've been casting a dark shadow ever since. Virtually the day I started, United Canada, which at the time was the trucking industry's major underwriter of truck liability insurance, went bankrupt. And we had a situation where thousands of Canadian trucking companies were roaming North America without any insurance at all. So that was a bit of an ordeal by fire, and I learned very quickly the importance of safety, the importance of the need for industry and regulators to work together to get through that crisis, and we did. Now, I can't see the damn thing. There we go. There's a guy with a chin down there you might remember. At that time, as well, Canada was moving towards economic deregulation of the trucking industry. Freedom to Move, which was Don Mazankowski, the Minister of Transport of the day, his policy paper had come out in July, and it presented the blueprint for the lowering of barriers to entry in the trucking industry. Now, we would later find out that this was all part of the deals that led ultimately to the first Canada-U.S. trade agreement, but it was a very, very intense process that the industry and governments went through. And one of the things that was expressed by all quarters at that point, because we saw what happened with the changes to the MCC Act in the United States in 1980, was a concern over what was going to happen to safety when you opened up the floodgates of competition to anyone. So the Freedom to Move tried to take a uniquely Canadian approach and introduced the concept of a Canadian antidote to any compromise in safety that might result as a result of deregulation. So we were told at that time that the primary focus of trucking regulation would be safety. We were told that insurance would become the regulator of the industry, not government anymore. And in fact, there was a provincial-federal agreement that was reached at that time to introduce a, quote, uniform national safety code. Now, uniform is a word that was used a lot back then, and it's a word that in subsequent years, as the NSC developed, we as industry kept going back to, because we weren't exactly enamored with the idea of economic deregulation. Why would you, if you were controlling the market and profit was easy, why would you want to give that up? We received no compensation like the softwood lumber guys are getting and that sort of thing. So we really relied on the fact that there was going to be this uniform national safety code, not only in terms of its form, but also in terms of how it was going to be enforced, so that all of these new entrants that we argued didn't know how the hell to run a trucking company wouldn't start cutting back on safety and maintenance. So it's a concept, the NSC, that the industry really strongly supported and had a great hand in trying to develop. The problem was then, as it is now, is that the NSC is not national, and nor is it codified. So it's been sort of improperly named from the beginning. And the expectation of a uniform national safety code eventually and over time gave way to other concepts like harmonized, nationally consistent, compatible, and today we talk, the most recent one is about cohesiveness. And that's all fine, and whatever you call it, it still remains a challenge to this day, although we could debate whether some of the differences, how material they really are in terms of impacting on carrier safety performance and ultimately in terms of a level playing field. And as I indicated earlier, enforcement and how the rules are enforced is just as important as what the rules are at the end of the day. So notwithstanding the differences which still exist today, and some I'll grant are probably more material than others, overall truck safety has improved, and we can't deny that. We did in fact see that underbelly in those years immediately following deregulation, and the mechanical fitness of the vehicles was nothing compared to what it is today, and those sorts of things. So we can say in a sense it's worked. And carriers are a resilient lot, and whether they like it or not, they've learned to live with most of the differences as well. And at times, I'll be the first to say, industry has contributed to the lack of harmonization. Ours is not a homogeneous industry by any stretch of the imagination. There are lots of opinions, and even within the CTA Federation, there are different layers to things as well. So, we certainly understand the challenges that exist in Canada, in our federal system, of trying to come up with harmonization. Carriers have often been motivated for differences as well. If the opportunity is there, why not seek it, either to gain competitive advantage or to at least level the playing field, or at times, because too often we seem to gravitate towards the lowest common denominator in terms of safety standards, to seek a higher standard. And there's some good examples of that. Heidi mentioned the mandatory activation of speed limiters, which I know was somewhat controversial. I don't hear a whole lot about it these days. But Ontario and Quebec did move forward, and that was a suggestion made by industry because we wanted to see better enforcement of highway speeds. Similarly, Ontario has just recently has adopted mandatory entry-level training for truck drivers. So you might argue, and that was promoted by industry again. And so you might say, well, industry is talking out of both sides of its mouth in terms of harmonization, because there you are pushing for melt. Well, I guess, you know, it takes leadership sometimes to move a ship forward. So we've been prepared to stick our neck out and at times, and found if we can find a partner within government to work with us on that, then we're happy to do so. You know, CTA has taken what I think are much more aggressive or modernized, progressive positions with respect to safety over the last 15 or 20 years. Some of the positions that we have today would have been unthinkable 30 years ago. And I think that's an indication that our sector has emerged. We're now, I would say, you know, in our early 30s with regards to the trucking industry of today. We've gone through the teenage years and all of that, and today now we're concerned about our families and mortgages and all of those business things. So, you know, for years we were chastised at times, certainly urged and encouraged by governments to internalize the cost of safety and to really look at safety as good business, and we've done that. I think now that at least the carriers that I represent, the vast majority see the return on investing in safety and maintenance for the good of their business. Now, I think that regulations also need to support this, what is really a cultural change that's been underway for the last 10 or 15 years. And again, in a big industry, in a fragmented industry, it's going to take time. So that's problematic. We also have a situation where about half the trucks on the road are owned and operated by companies that are not in the trucking industry. Companies that they have a stake in whatever sector they are involved in, but they don't have a stake in the success of the trucking industry. And they don't have a stake in the safety of the trucking industry to the same degree as we in the trucking industry do. Now, that's a problem perhaps at times, but I don't really think it matters to Mrs. Smith, who's driving her Volvo down the highway. To her, a truck is a truck is a truck, and she has the right to expect that all trucks and all truck drivers are meeting the highest possible safety standards. And I would argue she probably would be surprised if she learned what the actual situation is. And I think it shouldn't matter to government either, whether it's a private truck or a for-hire carrier. And that when we develop regulations, a truck is a truck is a truck. Now, safety is always evolving, and we have to evolve as an industry with it, and so must the regulatory environment. And I would say to you that we all need to do better. And that, again, the pursuit of harmonization should never be used as an excuse to gravitate towards the lowest common denominator. You know, harmonization is mentioned every time the Canada Transportation Act is reviewed, which is every 5 years by an act of Parliament. It's reviewed every time some government or politician starts talking about smart regulations or reducing red tape. But for us, it's not just about reducing regulations. In fact, and we'll talk about some examples later, where we're calling for additional regulation. What we want to see are effective regulations, and we want to be in a situation to be able to better manage the differences in regulation so that that doesn't impose a burden or a cost in and of itself. And what we're talking about more and more these days is about regulations that are out of date and the length of time that it takes to change them. That may be our biggest challenge that we as industry and you as regulators face today, and that's ensuring that the regulatory environment stays up to date, up to speed with the improvements in our ability to understand the science of things, the changes in modern supply chains, industry practices, and technological developments, which are moving at a breakneck pace. Now, myself and there are a few other gray hairs in the room, dedicated about a decade of our life to developing the so-called modernized federal hours of service standard. The reality is, by the time we finally got it done, it was no longer modern, but notwithstanding, that's what we called it. Now, this was a very complex matter, and we were dealing with the science of fatigue as we understood it, and the industry bought into the fact that the science of fatigue was going to outweigh our economic issues every time. So we as industry accepted that and said, okay, let's sit down and let's come up with the best possible regulation based on the science as we know it. Now, as frustrating as it was that it took over a decade to actually achieve that, what is really of concern and still is of a concern today, that it didn't take the ministers all came to, I think it was Winnipeg, to sign a memorandum of understanding. Before their planes touched down back in their provincial capitals, half of them had changed their minds, decided to alter the federal standards somewhat, some more than others, and a good number of them just ignored the whole damn thing and never did introduce the national standard, not only in terms of its application to federally regulated carriers, but at the provincial level as well, which was supposed to have been part of the deal. So, you know, that's of concern to us. So we've been arguing for some time that our institutions, our processes, and our systems for dealing with regulatory cohesiveness, harmonization, compatibility, whatever you call it, both within Canada and between Canada and the United States, are in need of re-energizing, modernization, or in some cases, replacement. Now, just recently, these smiling faces introduced something called the Canada Free Trade Agreement. And as part of that agreement, they incorporate probably the biggest feature of it was the regulatory reconciliation / cooperation table, which, you know, we hope will provide the needed focus to actually begin to deal with some of these things. And it's interesting that in announcing SIFTA, the minister specifically drew attention to the hours of service regulation. So better late than never, I suppose, but let's see what happens. Now, we're encouraged by reaching this agreement, and this is I think the third or fourth internal trade agreement during my 32 years, and the previous 3 didn't accomplish very much, but to avoid going completely out of our minds, we set aside our cynicism once again and hope for the best this time around. But I think we have reason to be suspect. The table's decisions will not be binding on provinces. Provinces can opt out of reconciliation agreements if they do not have an existing measure that's being talked about by the table, or if they determine that reconciliation is not a desirable option for their jurisdictions. And even the ministers that we're seeing up here eventually at the end said, look, this is a good start, but there's a hell of a lot of work to do. So we'll see. I know there's committee of deputy ministers and this and that. We shall see whether we're any better off in 5 years than we are today. An issue that reflects a lot of the concerns that I've raised, I think, is Canada's path to adopting ELDs. CTA first came to CCMTA in 2004, 13 years ago, proposing that Canada introduce a universal mandate requiring the use of electronic logging devices wherever a logbook is currently required. Interestingly, the American Trucking Association didn't adopt that position until 2011, many years afterwards. We knew, and I think any reasonable person knew even back in 2004, that this was an inevitability, that the United States was certainly going to go and that Canada should go. We were prepared as an industry to go it alone, to lead. There was nothing wrong with being first because it was and is the right thing to do, and somebody has to take leadership. So we invited all of your predecessors to come to a meeting in Toronto to discuss a Canadian strategy and plan for moving forward. We didn't get any takers. What we were told was we needed to wait and see what the Americans are going to do. Well, now we know. And frankly, we've known for some time what the Americans were going to do. Yet here we are in 2017, and I don't want to disparage the work that has been done on the standard and some of the operational work that's being done, or the fact that we all anticipate that Gazette Part 1 for ELDs will be issued sometime in the next, we hope, few weeks. But we still do not have an agreement amongst the provinces in terms of how we're going to move forward on this. And I find that quite disturbing. I still hear arguments from governments and from some of the opponents about the costs of such a program to carriers, to certain sectors of the economy, to certain sizes or weights of equipment, and to government. Arguments that, quite frankly, I think were discounted a long time ago. And I find it mind-boggling that anyone can still credibly believe that a paper-based system is more effective or a more efficient way to monitor and enforce hours of service, which is arguably the most important standard in the National Safety Code. And for the record, the vast majority of drivers, once trained and exposed and using ELDs, love them. All you have to do is go out to a carrier and see if the system goes down and hear the bitching from the drivers then. There's no more form and manner errors, no more having to spend 20 to 30 minutes a day filling out a logbook or 2 or 3. No more pressure from dispatchers or shippers to get creative. It's a good thing. Now, the horse is out of the barn already in terms of what the U.S. is going to do, as I said, and I'm all for compatibility with the United States because no country is as vulnerable as Canada is to trade with one other country, and that being the United States. 75% of everything we produce in Canada goes to the U.S. Over 40% of our gross domestic product is dependent upon trade with the U.S. I get it. And I know how complex the U.S. regulatory system is and that we need to keep a cautious eye out. But that should not mean that Canada cannot or should not be prepared to lead, or at the very least, to have something concrete to offer, to be able to bring our informed experience to the table, to seek a seat at the table, to try to develop truly North American standards. The politics of U.S. Congress and the compromises FMCSA may have to make are very different from what we might encounter in Canada. And yes, we are the junior partner in the relationship. I understand that. But from personal experience, I also know how hard it is to get the attention of the U.S. and at times to keep them at the table. But from personal experience, I also know that it can be done. The United States doesn't have a monopoly on good ideas. Our carriers compete with U.S. carriers every day. We don't carry anyone else's hockey bag when it comes to safety, fuel economy, productivity, or efficiency. It's no coincidence that Canadian carriers continue year after year to win the major U.S. fleet safety awards. No coincidence at all. But Canada has to speak with one voice. I don't blame the U.S. for not wanting to deal with 14 different jurisdictions. I spent a lot of time in recent years on border issues, and I've asked myself questions like, why aren't ELDs dealt with through things like the Canada-US Regulatory Cooperation Council? It's a bit late for that now, but what about the next standard? What about the next technological or scientific advancement? Sleep apnea, collision avoidance systems, onboard cameras, and the like. Canadians are as fascinated and concerned as we've been in a long, long time about the future of the Canadian-US relationship and what the new administration's intentions are for trade with Canada, and for good reason. As I have said before, no other country is as vulnerable to trade with one other country as Canada is to the United States. But anything that impairs the efficiency, reliability, and predictability of the supply chain, whether that's delays on our highways, punitive border taxes or levies, excessive security measures, protectionism, they all impair the competitiveness of both countries, but obviously the stakes are higher for Canada. Investment will flow where it's easiest to do business and where market access is best. So you want to avoid problems at the border, set up shop in the US. That's where most of our production is going anyway. There's no doubt that the border has thickened over the last 15 or 16 years, and striking the right balance between security and trade has proved difficult. Back in the mid-2000s, the US ambassador to Canada, Paul Cellucci, was often quoted as saying, "Security always trumps trade." I think that's as true today under the current administration as it was then. It's also an interesting pun. Cellucci, who's since passed away and was a great guy, had no idea that Donald Trump would actually become president. I'm not sure we still believe it, but that's another thing. NAFTA has served Canada well. It's served the trucking industry well. 2/3 of Canada-US trade by value moves by truck. A truck crosses the Canada-US border once every 2.5 seconds. 70% of those trucks are Canadian. It's a market we dominate in because our guys are good and they're competitive and they're productive and they know how to navigate the border. But it's also served the US well too. Canada is the United States' biggest customer by far, by far. We make things together. Our economies are integrated. 50% of Canada-US trade is intra-corporate. Think of the auto companies, food processors, and the like. The lowly piston can cross the border 7 or 8 times during the manufacturing process. But NAFTA is approaching 25 years. It needs to be modernized. And the negotiations, no doubt, are going to be tough. Now, in the end, the negotiators may simply deal with the old chestnuts, rules of origin, dispute settlement, softwood lumber, all those things the Americans think they're hard done by. But there are other opportunities potentially if Canada actually comes up with a position in terms of what it wants out of the negotiations, things that would better reflect modern logistics practices, labor mobility of truck drivers, true pre-clearance of freight, and where it makes sense, regulatory harmonization or reciprocity. Immediately after NAFTA, at the time that we entered into NAFTA, there were a whole group of what were called SAGITs, strategic somethings. And they were designed at the time to reach trilateral accord on true North American standards. But it was a month or so after we entered into NAFTA that Bill Clinton decided he wasn't going to open the southern border, which was part of NAFTA, to Mexican trucks, a situation that exists to this day, by the way. And with that, all of those other fora went out the window, and we've continued to operate in silos. So I'm hoping that at the very least, we might get some reinvigoration of, if not trilateral, because God knows what's going to happen with Mexico, US, but with bilateral fora between the United States and Canada. Maybe we can get some of that back on track and contribute to some new, truly Canada-US standards. But again, Canada has to speak with one voice, and we have to actually stand for something. So that's what I'm going to say about that. If you ask a carrier today what their biggest challenge is, even though we're stuck in a very low gear when it comes to the economy, most will say the human resources challenge and predominantly the shortage of qualified drivers. CTA last year conducted a study. It was actually an update of an earlier study we had done by the Conference Board of Canada. And it found that by 2024, the shortage of drivers in Canada, just in the for-hire sector, could reach 48,000. Now, this is a very complex issue. There are lots of factors, and there's no real silver bullet to it. You know, the things that are leading to the shortage, you can't avoid it. It's always compensation. Deregulation's worked. Our industry, being the benevolent industry it is, has given 86% of any productivity gains that it's achieved over the last 20 years to the customer in terms of low pricing. What's suffered in that is that the driver at the end of the day hasn't gotten, basically there's been no real growth in their salaries or what they take home at the end of the day. It's also not a problem just in terms of what they make, but how they're paid. You know, truck drivers being paid predominantly by the mile, that sort of thing. They can't plan their lives the way all of you can. Getting a mortgage and that sort of thing is very, very difficult for them because they just don't know what their income is going to be, and it's hard for them to predict. So we as an industry have got to address that. Lifestyle issues, try to get a millennial to say you're going to be away from home 4 weeks at a time, cooped up in a tractor with a sleeper berth, sort of hard. And the quality of training. It's all over the map. There are good schools and there are puppy mills. And then there's everything else in between. So, you know, those are tough issues. But underlying all of that is that we're facing a demographic tsunami, and we have for some time. And the slower growth in the economy has just simply taken some of the heat off the issue, but it's a temporary thing. We have one of the oldest, if not the oldest, workforces in the country. More importantly, we're aging more rapidly than any other segment of the workforce. The average age of a truck driver in Canada today is pushing 50, and I can tell you that in the area where the shortage is most acute, the long-distance, irregular route truckload marketplace, it's well over 50. Currently, over 30% of the driving force is over 55 years of age. We're losing tens of thousands a year to retirement, and we're not attracting anywhere near what one would consider our fair share of younger people into the business. The share of drivers between 25 and 34 is currently 15%. Those under 30, it's less than 9%. And that number is getting worse year by year by year as we continue to age. I mentioned there's also a lack of consistent training standards and license tests that don't reflect even the basic levels of skill where a trucking company would feel, a reputable trucking company would feel confident enough to hire that newly licensed person and then invest in them, provide them with additional training to turn into a professional truck driver. The mere fact that someone holds a CDL is no indication, again, that that person has even the basic level of skill to be able to safely and productively operate a tractor trailer. Across the country, my members tell me constantly that they turn away the vast majority of people that walk through the door seeking a job. That's not a good situation. What happens? Those people leave the industry. Before they leave the industry, they usually phone me and swear at me because they say, you told me that there's a driver shortage. I went and spent my $200 to get trained. I got my license and no one will hire me. Duh. That's not good. We're not getting them back. Or they end up going to, let's just say, those companies where safety is perhaps less of an issue for them in terms of a commitment. Bottom feeders attract bottom feeders, and we continue to perpetuate this underbelly of the industry that gives us all a bad name and disrupts the marketplace. Either way, it's a bad outcome for everyone. And for the most part, I would say it's industry's problem to fix. You know, it's the carriers that establish the working conditions, that establish the driver schedules. It's the carriers that go to market to get the rates and decides who gets paid what and how. That's our job, and somehow we're going to have to do that. And eventually the market will work. It just won't always go in a straight line, and it won't go at the pace perhaps we would like it to see. But there's also a role for government. An improperly or poorly trained driver is a safety risk to the public. And in an industry where there is a perceived safety problem or perceived safety risk, that impairs our attractiveness to people, either young people looking to come into the business or people looking to transition from, maybe they were laid off from their manufacturing job to come into trucking. So it hurts us, the fact that we have these inconsistent levels of training. For the first time, perhaps in a couple of generations, more and more young people, supported by their parents, guidance counselors, are saying, don't go to university and get that BA degree and end up spending your life in your parents' basement, like 2 or 3 of my kids, but go out and get a trade. The problem is that truck driving officially, for the most part, in most jurisdictions, still considered to be an unskilled trade. We're still lumped in with the burger flippers. It's not a trade. And too often, as a result, it's the job of last resort, and that's the kind of people that we're attracting. It's those realities that caused the provincial associations and CTA to call upon the governments across the country to introduce mandatory entry-level training for truck drivers. Safety demands that entry-level drivers have at least a basic level of skill. And we can't make the case that the occupation is skilled or at least semi-skilled if all you have to do is walk in off the street with no training or some puppy mill level of instruction, and you can take the CDL test in most provinces, and you're probably going to pass it. It's hard to make the case that we aren't unskilled when there's that sort of environment. So while it might be counterintuitive for the industry to be calling on governments to help us to raise the bar at a time that we have a driver shortage, we believe, excuse me, that over time it will only help to improve the attractiveness of the occupation, which will increase the numbers of qualified people, people we might actually want to hire coming into the business, and therefore their employability as well. Now, Ontario was the first jurisdiction to adopt MELT. It's coming into force on July 1st of this year, and it was a cooperative effort between industry and government from the get-go. It was a true partnership, and not just between MTO and OTA or CTA, but all segments of the industry, representatives of driver groups, the insurance sector, safety groups. We all worked together and we made it happen. And I really want to thank Heidi and her team. I know Maureen is here somewhere, Maureen Tetzlaff somewhere in the office. You know, it's been an incredible experience, and it wasn't easy. But we've made it happen, and I urge all of you to get with the program. We've just developed a detailed curriculum that you'll be amazed by, and we're prepared to share it with anybody, because this is the way to go, and it's something that's good for industry and good for the public. How am I doing on time? But, you know, one of the issues everybody's talking about these days is, well, again, there's a million titles for them: automated, autonomous, semi-autonomous, connected vehicles. We prefer to refer to them as automated vehicles, but even within that category, there are many levels. You know, today the technology that's available to supplement the skill of the driver and therefore to reduce the risk of human error which, as we know, is really the major cause of crashes, is incredible and growing every day. You know, and we also believe, so we think there's real potential in this technology. We also think if we can close the gap between vehicles, reach a common speed, better traffic flow, that will lead to improved fuel economy and reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. And despite what Donald Trump says, in Canada, we think that's a pretty good thing. You know, why wouldn't a trucking company want to become more fuel efficient when your second largest component of cost is fuel? Again, you know, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out. Two questions I get asked the most often about these vehicles is how soon will they be on the highway? And does this mean there'll no longer be a need for truck drivers? Well, the answer to question one depends on what we're talking about. As I said, automated vehicles are already out there and in widespread use. There's an ever-growing list of technologies and devices both outside of the truck and within the truck, cameras, collision pedestrian avoidance systems, all of those sorts of things that are being installed. I would guess that your kid's Honda Civic probably has most of this stuff now as standard equipment. My question would be, why isn't it standard equipment on the commercial vehicles that are out there? Why? Now, we need to decide what level of automation we need to mandate, obviously, and some things will take some time to mature, but I think this is where the regulators need to be looking in the future. Don't come to us talking about putting side guards on trucks to prevent cyclists from either being smashed as opposed to decapitated. Let's look at pedestrian avoidance systems and those sorts of things. Let's use the technologies that are out there that can be deployed on any sort of vehicle and start moving ahead on those, on those sorts of things. I mean, to us, it just makes sense. You know, platooning trucks is being tested all over North America now and Europe, and they're being used not far from here, well, not far compared to where most of us live, in the oil sands. They're being used in some of the major manufacturing centers, which are almost the size of cities themselves in different parts of the world. But in terms of fully autonomous trucks being on the highways in North America, I think that's further off than some people would like us to believe. And maybe not so much from a technological point of view, although there are still some issues in terms of how well they work and snow and ice and those sorts of things. But how they're going to react with standard vehicles, of which there are still going to be millions of them out there for many, many years to come. How long it's going to take before the infrastructure is in place, all the readers and that sort of thing that would be needed to be able to make a meaningful transition. And again, the key question is, how long is it going to take for governments to introduce the required regulatory changes that would allow us to use the damn things even if they were operational? I think all of that speaks to the fact that there will be another generation well beyond us that will still be talking about the use of those sorts of things. Now, recently, CTA held a roundtable where we had carriers, the major truck OEMs, and experts from Berkeley and whatnot to talk to us about these questions. And, you know, it was an interesting discussion, and I think that the views overall of the participants was rather sobering, frankly, and perhaps a good dose of reality. There are no carriers today that are including autonomous vehicles even in their long-term plans. It's just, it's not there, folks. A lot of what you're seeing is a lot of hype by the people developing the technologies. Of course, the issue of cost came up. Nobody's talked about what these vehicles might cost. I mean, to try to get into a CNG or LNG tractor is a 60% premium over a conventional truck. We don't even know what the cost of these vehicles will be. But the interesting thing, and I thought a particularly Canadian point of view on it, was many of the carriers felt that the potential productivity and efficiency benefits would be muted in Canada compared to the United States because we have a much more progressive weights and dimensions regime than they have in the US, where the standard vehicle is still the 80-pound tandem tractor semi-trailer, whereas we've got at least a dozen other common configurations, multi-axle vehicles that are much more productive, efficient, infrastructure friendly. So they felt that there really wasn't the same economic case to be made in Canada, perhaps, as in the United States. And many said that if Canada really wanted to get more productive and to reduce GHG, that we should be looking at heavier weights on LCVs, and we should be looking at expanding the LCV network, that would have a lot greater benefit than this sort of 40, 50-year time horizon on automated vehicles. They also pointed out that drivers do a hell of a lot more than drive. They're product experts. They load, they unload, they secure the freight. So the answer to question 2 is we're going to need truck drivers for a long, long time to come. And as Oscar Wilde said, rumors of my demise are greatly exaggerated. Am I doing all right? I got 1 minute? Okay, well, you're going to give me 2. Okay. I mean, I was worried how I was going to fill an hour, so I'm going to bloody well fill it. I started talking about safety, and I'm going to end talking about safety. And, you know, we all know that Canada intends to legalize the recreational consumption of cannabis. And CTA is making no judgment on the social merits or not of that policy. Our focus is solely and entirely safety, particularly as it pertains to the most obvious safety-sensitive occupation, the driver. We believe that there are several extremely important issues that need to be addressed before Canada flips the switch. And these are designed to protect the safety of the motoring public, with whom we share the road, the safety of our workplaces, and it's an employer's obligation to ensure, legal obligation, to ensure that our workplaces are safety, and that we don't denigrate our ability to conduct trade with the United States, because as you know, at the federal level, marijuana is still an illegal substance, and there's still U.S. mandatory alcohol and drug testing for commercial truck drivers. We also want to ensure that we don't spend the next 20 years in litigation as employers when we try to get a pothead off the road or an opioid head or whatever else you want. The Federal Task Force on Marijuana Legalization identified the need to guard against marijuana-impaired driving as a central objective. And I think there's broad recognition of this across the board. You know, addressing that will, as they've said, require a criminal code amendment to include marijuana offenses and a THC cutoff level similar to that of the 0.08 for alcohol. And secondly, it will require a practical, least invasive and legally acceptable roadside testing protocol. Fact is, neither of those things exist at the present time. I met recently, just before the legislation was introduced, with Bill Blair, the parliamentary assistant to the Minister of Justice, who's sort of former police chief of Toronto and the country's marijuana guru. And he said it will be 5 years before the science is able to provide that test of impairment and before we're able to have anything at roadside that's efficient. And I think some of you may have started some of these discussions. So what will happen in the intermeeting period is that we'll basically go to a zero tolerance level, much like the graduated licensing systems that exist for Class G licenses in Ontario and in British Columbia. Anything beyond a trace amount of cannabis in your system will lead not to a criminal charge, but to an administrative sanction, likely a suspension of your license for 24, 48 hours and a fine. That's what we're going to see. That's what zero tolerance looks like. At the same time, though, the employer is going to be required then to practice zero tolerance, which means we're going to have to be able to test. And yes, we can legally do post-accident and pre-employment before hire of drivers in Canada, but we can't do random testing currently, or it has been subject to never-ending human rights challenges, and it's something that Canada, we've tended to frown upon. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you can't have zero tolerance without random testing. And we've got to find a way to introduce that. Marijuana is not the only drug we should be testing for, but the fact that it's being legalized creates a whole set of issues that we haven't had to face before. And so we need to move in that direction. There's nothing, very little being talked about that, frankly, right now. It doesn't fall within the mandate of any of the 3 or 4 ministers who have this as part of their portfolio. And I don't think it's being talked about very much amongst the different groups that you may be involved in. And we've got to deal with that, and we've got to deal with how we deal with this in the workplace. You know, are we going to have to continue to employ people that decide to use this, not because they necessarily have an addiction or a problem, but use it because it's now a legal product? So that's something that, that is going to be really problematic. The human rights folks have grudgingly, I think, accepted random testing. If you're a driver or a company that goes to the United States, they've deemed it to be a bona fide occupational requirement. So they are prepared to accept it. In that case, I think governments need to give some direction to the human rights folks in this regard. I'm going to conclude now. These are challenging times, yes. I know how overworked you are. I know how overworked the carriers are, but it's also an exciting time. Anytime there's change, it's exciting, and the one constant will be change, so I think the future will be exciting as well. Markets are always going to change and adjust. The mix and trajectory of freight will shift. The trucking industry will evolve. The names on the sides of the doors will come and go. But at the end of the day, most of what people consume and most of what goes into business inputs in the production process will continue for this foreseeable future to be dominated from a shipment, from a transportation point of view, by trucking. All forecasts point to continued growth in the trucking industry at a pace that's greater than that of any of the other modes. And as administrators of the regulatory system by which the industry is governed, we urge you to continue to work with us on this journey. And I have to say that under Alison Rougeau's leadership, I think CCMTA has, in the last few years, begun to up its game, and I urge you to continue to support her. We have our challenges, but Canada remains the greatest country in the world to live in, and we also have, in my opinion, the most innovative, safety-conscious, and environmentally responsible trucking industry in the planet. Let's keep them both strong. Thank you very much, and all the best in the future.
Okay, we've got a microphone. That's great. We've got a microphone, and we'll open it up for some questions. We have about 5 minutes, so we can take 2 or 3 questions. So we'll open it up.
Rich.
Thanks, David. Speed limiters.
Yep.
Man, I'm somewhat puzzled by the fact that only a relatively small number of jurisdictions have adopted speed limiters, especially since they're considered to be so advantageous from a safety perspective. Has the CTA been made aware of any data? Possibly Heidi can step into this, I don't know, from Ontario or any other jurisdiction, about how they have affected safety? Like, do we have any research or quantifiable data yet that we can look back on?
I know we did a couple of years ago. It showed, for example, that there was an 86% compliance rate, and that the number of collisions involving, fatal collisions involving heavy trucks went down in those first few years after. But I think, you know, all you can draw is a correlation. There's always a lot of factors at play. And I think we're sort of in the situation now. I remember when we were as an industry researching whether we wanted to take this on. And, you know, we went to Europe where they had mandatory activation of speed limiters for 20 years. And we were asking the carriers and regulators over there for the very same thing. And they said, well, what are you, nuts? Like, they said, we don't even think about it anymore. It's been around for 20 years, so we don't keep the data anymore. It works. It only makes common sense that you're going to reduce either the frequency or the seriousness of the collisions. So get on with it. And I think probably, I'm guessing, but I think this is probably where MTO is now. It's been quite a while now, so I don't know that you keep that data as regular. I don't know.
Yeah, if I can send it to you after, Reg, but every program we implement, we do an evaluation of. We have one on this program. Claudia's at the back, but we don't have enough time for you to talk. But I can send it to you. But it did impact safety, as all the other programs do as well.
And the other thing it did too, Reg, as much as the safety, was the GHG reduction is significant. And, you know, I mean, it's still a little bit controversial, more so in the States, because up until Trump's election, they were talking about, I don't know if FMCSA is still going to move forward on it or not, but, you know, they were finally coming into the 21st century on these sorts of things. It still may come in through the back door in the phase 2 of the GHG regulations in the States. But, you know, when I think back to that debate, which was, you know, a tough one for the industry, because there were people that, you know, I find sometimes the people that complain most about how bad things are in the industry are the ones that least want to change it too. But anyway, you know, we heard all kinds of horror stories and that sort of thing. And every once in a while I'll run into an elephant race, but for the most part, I think people have gotten on with life. And, you know, I hear a lot more about, you know, we didn't like it, but boy, it saved us a lot of money in the end. I've clearly stunned them all. Well, I know it's part of your circadian trough and your uh-oh, I'm going to get trouble from them.
Yeah,
for those now, aren't I? I'm in trouble now.
Oh, no, you even knew who was all the group who's sitting up front here from the
Yeah.
East Coast, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, hello. It's a pleasure to hear you and a pleasure to get the benefit of a very well-prepared full hour of presentation. That was really a valuable conversation. And during it, you mentioned commercial skills testing. And that it's not just out of date, but it at best tests the rudimentary components of familiarity with the commercial vehicle and operation. Do you see, or does the industry here in Canada have any recommendations with regard to some method of screening drivers into the industry that's more effective, or do we all just accept it really requires additional mentoring or training by the carrier?
Yeah, I think as with most things, you know, it's a multi-pronged approach. You know, I know that the U.S. made some tentative steps towards entry-level training last fall, and I would hope that those aren't lost. I did detect, though, that the industry in the U.S., I think, is not as uniform as we here are in Canada. I think they'll catch up eventually. You know, the fact of the matter is there just aren't that many farm boys or guys coming out of the military, maybe in the U.S. a little different, who have been around machinery, can just step in and drive. There are still a few, but, you know, we can deal with those on a case-by-case. Those people just don't exist. And the people that are coming through the door today, they need a hell of a lot more training than drivers did 20, 30 years ago. So I would urge you to stick with that. But I think there's work for the industry, too, in terms of doing a better pre-screening job in terms of who is suited to be a truck driver as well. You know, I hear a lot of stories on both sides of the border about a guy who seems competent, give him the keys, all of a sudden he's been away from home for 4 weeks, and he said, I don't want this. You know, so we've got to do a better job, I think, of screening too, and making sure people are aware of what they're getting into. There's no shortage in the short P&D stuff and whatnot. It's just in the long distance, which in Canada is even more of an acute problem, I think, than in the U.S., because we don't have a hub and spoke type of economy the way you do. The regions, they're strong, but there's bigger distances to cover. So, you know, we're going to have to do do a lot of things to ensure, to supplement the skills of the drivers, and some of them are going to need a lot more supplementary stuff than others. So, but stick with it. You know, my dream always is that these things, if it's a good idea, it will eventually take hold everywhere. It just takes an awful long time. You know, I hope that whoever succeeds me will stick it out for 32 years to get some of this stuff done, because that's the kind of time frames we tend to look at things in. Okay.
I have a question.
Oh.
It's fast. So we talked about zero tolerance for marijuana.
Yeah, follow your own rules, will you?
I know. We talked about zero tolerance for drugs. It might be likely that if you bring in zero tolerance for drugs, you'd have to bring in zero tolerance for alcohol, both being legal substances. What is your thought on if we had to do both at zero tolerance?
Well, you know, that's interesting. And when I was meeting with Blair, he said, you know, that he wished, if he could turn the clock back, that we would have gone in Canada to that administrative approach as opposed to the criminal charge, because getting a conviction criminally is so difficult and so expensive. And is the deterrent factor really that much greater at the end of the day? Well, isn't it interesting that the federal government, in introducing the legislation on marijuana, wants to, and everybody's talking about how this is going to be the subject of human rights challenges now, wants to take that zero tolerance approach, at least in terms of the RIDE program not having reasonable suspicion. So it seems to me they're moving, or they're sending a signal of wanting to move in that direction. Look, from an industry's point of view, when I appeared before the National Task Force, I remember saying to Anne McClellan, who was the chairman, you know, we have to have this cutoff of impairment, and whatever it is for the general public, we're going to want to beat it at the commercial side. Like the de facto, at the commercial level, the blood alcohol, allowable level of blood alcohol is 0.04, not 0.08, which I thought was a really good thing. She looked at me and said, I cannot believe that you would allow your drivers to go out with any alcohol in their system whatsoever. You know what? She's right.
Great. Okay.
Thank you all.